Black Widow's hitting theaters, which means of the original Avengers, only Hawkeye is without his own movie, and that's never gonna happen. Have fun on TV, Clint. Hello everybody and welcome to my review of Black Widow. After a long break from theaters, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is back, although it feels like it never really left us because we've been watching it on TV all this time. But still, this is a movie, it's hitting the big screen, the first since Spider-Man Far From Home back in 2019, and it is a solo film for Natasha Romanoff, aka Black Widow, aka Scarlett Johansson. This movie is directed by Kate Shortland with the screenplay from veteran Marvel screenwriter Eric Pearson. As always, when a movie's just come out, this is not a spoiler review. However, I will be talking about things that have been revealed in trailers, in publicity, things that are public knowledge. So if you are going into this with zero knowledge, I am going to talk about things that we already know about the movie. So if you don't want to go in knowing anything, then you may want to press pause now or whatever and come back after you see the movie. But if you've seen the trailers, if you have a general knowledge of what the story of this film is and who the characters are from the trailers and the publicity materials, then fear not, there will be no spoilers in this review. Black Widow is not a ghost story, although that would have been kind of a really interesting way to take this character. It is instead set in what we would regard as the past of the MCU after the events of Civil War. And the movie finds Natasha Romanoff reunited with the only family that she knew before she was a member of the Avengers. The father is David Harbour, a former Soviet agent. Rachel Weisz is her mother. Florence Pugh is her sister. And all of them were separated years ago, but come back together as Natasha attempts to reckon with her past and her own Black Widow training that took place in the infamous Red Room. When we talk about Marvel movies, they got, I guess, as lucky as they could in some regards with this film because it really could have been made in a vacuum any time after 2016's Civil War. It's not tied to any current goings-on in the MCU, and if there was going to be a Marvel movie that was delayed for well over a year, Black Widow is probably not a bad choice. But while that may have been a strength for Marvel's publicity department and their sketchbook department, wherever they're mapping out this crazy map of whatever's happening with the MCU, I also think it's one of the movie's biggest weaknesses because Black Widow does feel overall, for lack of a better word, a little lightweight, a little bit superfluous. Does the movie add any greater understanding to the character of Natasha Romanoff? In my opinion, not really. That doesn't mean that it's a bad movie, but it doesn't really add anything substantial to the MCU that we didn't know already or that's required to know, although it does set up some things in a very interesting way that could perhaps be developments that happen down the line. But again, that could have been done anytime. So Black Widow is a movie that feels unstuck in time and not necessarily in a good way. Looking at the movie as a fan then, when you sort of remove it from the MCU storyline proper, I think what you're looking at is a pretty good action spy thriller. I think if it were to be completely divorced from the Marvel brand and just released on its own, it would have been received better than a movie like Red Sparrow or a movie like Salt. It's got some great action. It's got some good acting. Scarlett Johansson's really getting a victory lap here after Black Widow was killed off in Avengers Endgame way back in 2019. It feels like a different lifetime ago. And this is perhaps comforting for those who felt that Black Widow was eternally getting the shaft as far as movies in the MCU. I remember many times on Movie Fights going all the way back to when we started that show doing like 2015, we were asking or pitching Black Widow movies because we thought, well, wait a minute, where is it? Where is this Black Widow movie? It seems like they're eternally working on it, and yet they never actually make it. This feels like a makeup movie, but it doesn't necessarily feel like it was engineered to be some big goodbye to the Black Widow character. And I think if you're going to put it in this timeline, in this part of the MCU, this is what the movie should feel like. Instead, it feels like a movie that perhaps could have been delayed from all the way back in 2017 and released today, and you really couldn't tell much difference. Of the Black Widow family, David Harbour and Florence Pugh are the standouts. Rachel Weisz, who is a fantastic actor, doesn't get a whole lot to do. I think that her role is more functional than anything, and it's not necessarily her fault, it's just the mechanics of the script. But I really enjoyed every moment that David Harbour and Florence Pugh were on screen. They interact well with Scarlett Johansson. It doesn't necessarily feel like retconning. It does feel like these are people that could have been part of Natasha Romanoff's life at some point, and we're being introduced to them for the first time. That is one of the strengths of the movie. It could have felt like one of these things where, oh, why didn't you mention it? It's similar to the way that I felt about F9, where you're just adding characters that are supposedly part of the family. Well, where were they all of those years? Because this has been such a cryptic character, it does make sense that we wouldn't know about these characters. I just wish that we'd known about them maybe a little bit earlier in her storyline. It may have informed what happened to her later on in a more crucial way. Ray Winstone pops up in what I think is destined to be one of the most forgettable MCU villain turns. And again, that's really nothing against Ray Winstone. It's just kind of the part that's been written. And then we also have Taskmaster. This was a villain that I was very excited to learn and see more about because the setup is cool. Taskmaster is a supervillain who has studied the fighting techniques of all the Avengers and is then able to mimic those techniques when fighting the Avengers. And it's such a cool setup. And there are so many times when Taskmaster would show up and break out some kind of an Avengers power or an Avengers weapon, and I'd be like, all right, here we go. This is going to be a great fight scene. And then it would just kind of unfold like any other fight scene against a villain that we've seen in the MCU over and over again. This really was kind of confusing to me because this is such a cool concept for a supervillain, such a cool idea, and there are so many interesting ways to have gone with it, and yet they really didn't go in any particularly interesting way with it. Of all the things I was a little underwhelmed by in the movie, this was the thing that I was the most disappointed by. I really try not to bring my expectations of what a movie is going to be too much into it, but the setup for this villain is so cool that to see a payoff that's so not cool is a letdown for me. I think the issue with this film is that much like Pixar, greatness is expected from so many different Marvel movies. And Marvel, I will say, has a much more spotty record, in my opinion, than Pixar has. But I do think the anticipation is there. And this isn't Black Widow's fault either. There's maybe even more anticipation because it's been such a long wait since the last Marvel movie. But this one does not achieve greatness like so many other Marvel films. I think that Black Widow achieves acceptability. The fight scene is fine. The story is fine. Although you can kind of guess where the story is going. It's pretty predictable. I was able to spot 2 or 3 things from way down the road and was not that surprised when it turned out that the thing that I was pretty sure was going to happen did indeed happen. On a positive note, it gets better as it goes. I found the first act of the movie to be kind of dull, if I'm being honest. The second act was better. You have a couple really good set pieces, and then it finishes strong. I liked the third act of the movie the best out of all 3 acts. So if you're going to finish, it's better to finish strong than to start strong and kind of whimper as you go. As a spy action movie, it's a recommendation, and I don't think that this is a bad movie, but for MCU fans, for people that have been waiting for this movie, not just for the 2 years that it's taken since the last MCU film almost hit theaters, but also for people that have been waiting for a Black Widow movie for this long, I fear that you are going to be disappointed because it is not exceptional. And when you've been building to making this movie for so long, and when you've taken so long, and really the excuse for not having a Black Widow movie is that, oh, it's going to be worth it. We've got a really good idea. When it doesn't come out that great, when it comes out fine, to avoid it this long, part of me wonders, why bother? Maybe we'll get some great stuff coming out of this film, but like I said, it's a recommendation, but certainly not an enthusiastic recommendation. And as a fan of the character, as a fan of Scarlett Johansson, I wish that they could have done something better for her at this point that maybe could have recontextualized Black Widow's place in the MCU instead of adding a footnote to it. So those are my thoughts on Black Widow. Are you looking forward to seeing it? We've got over a week till it hits theaters here domestically. Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thank you so much for watching. If you want to see even more of what I'm up to, you can check me out on Patreon at patreon.com/Dan Murrell. As a matter of fact, these are a few of my producer level patrons. They're at the highest tier. We are wrapping up the month. We've got our movie club happening. We have a commentary on the way, a lot of Schmodown commentaries and things like that. If you're a fan of the Schmodown, so many great things over on Patreon. I'd love to have you come join me there. Also, don't forget that later this week, we've got more reviews coming. We have the live show coming, my podcast, All My Movies. Lots of things still upcoming here on the channel as we ramp up toward the July 4th weekend. Thank you so much for watching this review. Please be sure to like, share, subscribe, do all those wonderful YouTube things, and come back. But first and foremost, stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.